Well, first of all, I want to thank, as everyone has and should, Natalia Milinković in particular, and the other organizers of this conference, and very timely, and it's been working very well. Of course, interesting discussions, and I want to thank all of you who have come this morning, and so I will just start this paper. Everyone here knows about Imperial Rome. It was great. As a matter of fact, as I learned during my last trip to this area, the vast majority of Rome's later emperors were born on what is now the territory of Serbia. The Romans thought that they were great. What stronger proof of this is there than the fact that, for them, the Mediterranean Sea was Mare Nostrum. And yet, eventually, Rome fell, invaded by unfriendly aliens from the east, or xenoi as they were called in Koine Greek, or hoi xenoi being the objects of xenophobia. And it was gradually undermined by subversive religions that were contemptuous of the old gods. As the centuries went by, one of those religions, having become dominant in the western parts of the old Roman Empire, attempted to appropriate its prestige by claiming the existence of a Holy Roman Empire, but the charade never worked very well, and Rome never became great again. Well, eventually there was Mussolini, but that is another story. As we know, everything in our modern world happens at breakneck speed as compared with historical evolution in the past. So it was within the lifetime of everyone here that members of the staff of the United States President Bush, emperor of the second Bush dynasty, retrieved the words of an obscure Roman writer, oderint dum metuant, words best translated as, "let them hate us as long as they fear us," by way of expressing American imperial dominance as illustrated in the war on Iraq. As I wrote in a paper that I presented in Moscow and that was published in translation in Voprosi Filosofi in 2003, and I will quote at some length from what I wrote there, "If one looks at a globe and focuses on the westernmost part of the American state of Alaska and the easternmost part of the newest partner in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, one sees that only a few kilometers of the Bering Strait prevent NATO from complete encirclement of the Earth. Not only the North Atlantic Ocean, but the Northern Pacific Ocean as well, are Marea Nostra, our seas. By contrast, the once mighty Roman Empire confined the designation Mare Nostrum to the Mediterranean Sea alone." I continue, "Who in fact are the we to whom the world's oceans belong? Although a completely accurate answer to this question would require including some reservations and qualifications and adding some codicils, the simple answer at the present moment in time is to the United States government. The regime currently in power has made use of the infamous events of September 11, 2001, and of the sympathy that was expressed for the United States immediately after those events, in order to demand fealty from the rest of the world. As the de facto president, Mr. Bush, expressed it in his speech to Congress of September 20th of that year, quote him, "Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. From this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime." End of the Bush quote. And we should add, the Bush administration has arrogated to itself the power to determine what does and what does not constitute terrorism and to attack preemptively. So that's the end of the quotation from my article of 2003. That was true greatness, was it not? But since then, times have changed, and they have changed very rapidly. The United States has another de facto president who, like Bush, received a smaller popular vote than his opponent and profited from some very questionable activities that are still the objects of investigation. who appears to be in principle an individual of Mare Nostrum, or better in his megalomaniacal case, a Mare Meum individual, but who, somewhat paradoxically, took and continues to take as his slogan, "Make America Great Again." As I am far from the first person to note, this clearly implies that America has fallen from greatness. And indeed, given the fact of Trump's now occupying the presidency, it is clear that it has fallen from greatness, assuming, that is, that we could reach agreement on what constitutes national greatness. If we make two further assumptions, A, that Trump's diagnosis of the historical decline of the United States at the time at which he decided to run for presidency is true, and B, that my historical analogy between the fall of Rome and the fall of the United States, the first fall of Rome, to recall Marx's famous treatment of Louis Napoleon being a tragedy, the second a farce. If we assume that has a certain validity, that analogy, then it is hard to avoid, although I tried to dismiss it earlier, the suspicion that Trump is our Mussolini. As an emissary to this conference from the land of the horror clown, I assume that I am expected both to furnish some explanations of the extraordinary behavior that has been taking place recently in that land, and to try to establish at least some connection between that behavior in general and the theme of this conference, xenophobia, identity, and new forms of nationalism. As many of us remember, Donald Trump launched his campaign for the presidency by coming down some steps inside his New York City building known as Trump Tower and proclaiming that Mexico in particular was responsible for sending rapists and murderers into the United States across an inadequately protected southern border. One of his earliest rallying cries concerned the supposed need to build a wall all along that border. This seems still to appeal to his most ardent followers, even though it is obviously an extremely silly idea for many reasons. The enormous cost, the sheer impossibility of doing it at all along certain segments of the border, the fact that it would not serve as a greater deterrent to crossing than the various fences and surveillance systems already in place, and so on. Then, upon assuming the office of president, Trump issued a ukase against admitting into the United States citizens of certain predominantly Muslim countries, an action that, poorly thought out and full of ambiguities, led to anger, confusion, and a quick intervention by federal courts to block its implementation. However, it is now partially in effect in somewhat altered form. Meanwhile, everyone has heard of the disastrous decision to discourage immigration from Mexico by separating parents from their children, accompanied by another decision to revise previously accepted standards for successful asylum seekers so as to make the granting of asylum much more difficult, virtually impossible for many, including in particular women who are victims of severe abuse, many who would previously have qualified for asylum. I could go on and on with detailed illustrations of Trumpist xenophobia, but it seems unnecessary since it is so blatant and so obvious. However, I thought it necessary to offer a brief summary just in order to confirm the connection with our conference theme. Perhaps after 1 2/3 years of Trump's presidency, it is time for an initial reckoning. Has he made America great again? Or is he still working on it but on his way? In my abstract for this conference written some time ago, I left the impression that my answer was no to the first part of my question. No, he has not made America great again. But perhaps that is too hasty an answer. For one thing, the United States has limped along across the decades and now more than 2 centuries since its inception with certain Republican, small r, institutions and practices that it has tried to promote throughout the world, reinforced by slogans such as the rule of law. But please remember the comparison with Rome once again. True, Rome expanded greatly while it was still a republic, but then came the empire with its strong commitment to authoritarianism, and thereafter it reigned supreme for several more centuries. There seems to be no doubt that Trump is more committed to authoritarianism than to the rule of law. A recent poll showed that 60% of Americans do not believe that he respects the rule of law. The Romans built walls around their borders, limites of the empire, the Roman Empire. For example, the one built by the Emperor Hadrian in Britain to keep out the barbarian Scots to the north. And the Romans engaged in massive hypocrisy, for example, bearing the insignia SPQR, the Senate and the Roman people, Senatus Populusque Romanos, into battle long after their armies acted in the service of neither the Senate nor the Roman people. What observers often describe as most characteristic of Trump is his utter hypocrisy and fondness for lies, great and small, beginning with his claim, which photographers working for him hastened to support by cropping their photos in very appropriate ways, that the crowd at his inauguration was the largest ever. Indeed, the magnitude, the greatness of Trump's mendacity has been measured with statistical precision by journalists perusing his speeches and tweets and documenting the astounding number of his misstatements, over 5,000 since he was inaugurated, according to the careful count by the Washington Post newspaper as of 2 weeks ago. That is 8 public lies per day. For his followers, at least, the virtual reality that Trump has conjured up by his incessant fictions is far superior to the mundane so-called reality that television, radio, and newspaper reporters claim to be the truth. Auctoritas muri magna deceptio, realitas extra realitatem. How great is that? Contemporary American nationalism has, by comparison with many other nationalisms, certain peculiarities based on the fact that, as the blunt expression goes, we are a nation of immigrants. Of course, there are Native Americans, descendants of the original inhabitants, but their numbers are very small, the result of various kinds of genocide. I mean, genocide through infectious diseases as well as simple slaughter, and diluted by several centuries of sporadic intermarriage with non-natives. More important, though, is the fact that the lands from which the immigrants came are diverse, although until now a majority European. So the Trumpian effort to rekindle xenophobia, which is very real and supported even more blatantly and enthusiastically by many of his core followers than by Trump himself, encounters the problem of just how to identify the xenoi. In the infamous march in Charlottesville, Virginia, Jews were explicitly called out. It would have gone without saying among those marchers that Mexicans and other Latin Americans, Muslims of all ethnicities, and African Americans were on the side of the invading enemy. Remember that Trump himself, in the years before he became a presidential candidate, kept insisting, as was mentioned yesterday, that Barack Obama had been born in Kenya. But some lines are difficult even for radical bigots to draw. Who's a xenos and who's not. Up to a century ago, there was extreme animosity toward Chinese. And before that, it was the Irish who were especially hated. And before that, well, racial hatred has always been an important, although in retrospect often underestimated, aspect of American history. If making America great again means, among other things, resurrecting a gloriously xenophobic past, as it certainly seems to mean in the minds of hardcore Trumpians, then there is abundant material available. But the problem of just who the internal enemies are remains a serious one. It must be resolved soon. It is generally agreed that the portion of the American population that is not purely white will reach over 50% by the year 2050 and probably sooner. In fact, as I noted in my abstract, we know who the enemy is ourselves. This comic strip from the Vietnam War period, Pogo, where he famously said, "We have met the enemy and they are us." Make no mistake, the level of political antagonism among Americans has not been as high in all probability since the American Civil War as it is now. I'm sure that I have never before heard such constant negative criticism of a president and other politicians by major commentators on television as one hears constantly now. Increasingly, one hears some of those commentators, such as Bob Woodward, the former the highly respected journalist whose latest book, Fear, has just been published, or the former National Security Director, James Clapper, express real fears of their own that serious dangers lie ahead, given the president's lack of self-control, his childishness, and his sheer lack of knowledge of political realities. The president, for his part, is constantly sending out tweets denouncing his enemies, who are legion, and calling them by disparaging names. And the list of those who have worked closely with him and who have more recently confessed to various forms of criminality grows weekly, or so it seems. Perhaps, say the optimists, Trump's tendency to create chaos is in fact a clever ploy on his part. Perhaps he is not nearly so stupid as he appears. After all, he did win the election, although it is universally agreed now that he did not expect to do so. And he has suggested in his ghost-written book about making deals that the creation of a certain degree of chaos is part of his modus operandi. The example from Trump's presidency that is most often mentioned in this context is the amazing course of his relations with Kim Jong-un, from Trump's threats of raining fire and fury down on North Korea to a seemingly cordial and indeed loving relationship, which could, of course, revert to fire and fury at any time. The Roman parallel, fire and fury, the Roman parallel that comes most to mind in regard to Trump's love of chaos is, of course, Nero. Like Trump, Nero took on the role of an actor from time to time, and he is rumored, although at least one writer, Tacitus, was somewhat skeptical of this rumor, to have started the great fire that consumed large parts of the city of Rome. In any event, the destruction of the mansions on the Palatine Hill that was one result of the fire allowed Nero to build an enormous palace, the Domus Aurea, replete with a huge statue of himself. In fact, it can be argued in general that Nero made Rome, which might have been expected to have suffered a serious setback by virtue of the fire, even greater after it, although it is true that he himself did not live many more years. Perhaps more than being our Mussolini, Trump is our Nero, or at least would aspire to that role if he knew enough history. In the last analysis, there is some reason to doubt Trump's qualifications as the embodiment of American nationalism that he pretends to be. No, I'm not claiming that he was born in Kenya, although the borough of Queens in New York City, where he was born and grew up, seems rather foreign to someone like myself who was born in the borough of Manhattan. But his mother came from the very land of Scotland whose inhabitants the Romans built their wall to keep out of Roman Britain. And Trump first married someone from beyond the Roman limites, namely Slovakia, and is currently married to someone from the borderlands of Roman territory, namely Slovenia. What sort of true nationalist is it who marries foreigners? Hardcore American nationalists, such as David Duke of Ku Klux Klan fame, have found Trump's presidency to be extremely useful for their cause, but they do not exactly regard him as one of their own. After all, they like to think that the Klan has certain standards to uphold. When contemplating Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," it is difficult for an Anglophone not to think of a very famous line from Shakespeare. As Shakespeare has one of his characters read in a letter given to him, "Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." America is so lucky to have greatness thrust upon it by its horror clown. Of course, the letter was a trick, successfully deceiving a very naive character, Malvolio, in the play Twelfth Night, and the same holds for the current situation. It's a trick. Incidentally, as you may know, the setting of Twelfth Night is the Dalmatian coast, Illyria. Trump successfully deceived a certain naive segment of the American population. One difference at this point is that Malvolio was thought mad and locked up, the faith that Trump wished for his opponent, Hillary Clinton, because Malvolio carried out certain instructions as to how to dress that he read in that letter, Whereas up to the present time, neither any of Trump's followers nor Trump himself has been confined as insane, although the process of imprisoning some of his former advisors has begun. In any case, while he may eventually succeed in getting us all blown up, until now, Trump's attempt to thrust greatness back on the American people, who, according to him, were born to greatness but somehow lost it, is above all an illustration on a grand scale of Marx's famous comment that I made before about that I quoted before about the second repetition of history constituting farce. Thank you, Marx, thank you, Rome, and thank you, Shakespeare.
The nice thing is, good morning for everyone.
Good morning.
Still morning. Thank you for this invitation, which was very motivating for me. It was something like 6 or 5 months ago, so it was enough time to work on the paper, so that's why I have narrowed down something from the scope of this topic. You will see what. Let me say something like a short intro story. When I was about to set out on the trip, some of my friends and colleagues said to me, "Why you are going to Serbia?" It's paraphrase. It's so close to us. Or I could say, I am for the first time in Serbia. It's very interesting to be here. Yeah. So this is the story. Why to go to the neighboring country if you are so frequently there? Is there any obstacle to do that? The questions follows how different someone should be from another person in order to be considered by that person as a stranger. How much of a stranger is needed for the both in order to look at themselves as members of different groups, alien one to another? What is a lower limit, a sort of threshold for the other, that is person, group, nation, etc., to be considered irrevocably strange or and alien to me, to us? These may be important questions in multi-ethnic settings like Bosnia and Herzegovina, the country in which the people share a common fate for centuries. What might have been them a single people, a nation? Is there a common language, common history, a common state of a long time shared imperial province, and first of all, living in a close neighborhood? And yet, it is within that long existing culture of interdependence and sharing that the three major groups maintains their specific communal bodies. What makes and maintains them as distinctive groups what makes them are their specific ethnic and religious identities. However, even their ethnic difference is not to be taken for granted. If ethnic difference means, in the first place, a difference in cultural makeup and heritage, then it is religious particularity of each of these groups that made them ethnically distinctive. What appears as important distinctive traits of ethnicity, like custom, ritual, public holiday, dress, behavior, etc., always bear imprints of the practice of collective worship. What the three major communities have most in common seems to be this fragile and subtle difference between ethnicity and religious affiliation. Their almost complete overlapping entails that ethnic and religious designations can be used interchangeably or as compound nouns. Thus, we have Catholic Croats, Muslim Bosniaks, and Orthodox Christian Serbs. These are the peoples that the post-war constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina refers to as constitutive peoples. So these peoples, legally and politically defined as the bearer of the state sovereignty, are in the heart of their collective identities ethno-religious communities. The most distinctive feature of this sort of communities is that their two identity components are actually inseparable. When analyzing how mutually close or similar are these communities, one may be inclined to hold that the different religions, like Christianity and Islam, or religious denominations like Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, offer the most important dividing lines. However, if this kind of boundary markers were not underpinned by the more solid and persistent, genuinely ethnic footings, all three communities may be suspected of being fruits of a religious split that once divided the Bosnian people, or of having prospects of being reunited as one nation. In one of his last interviews, which he gave to Giancarlo Bossetti in 1993, in the time of ongoing war in Bosnia, Karl Popper stated, quote, "Communism has been replaced by this ridiculous nationalism. I say ridiculous because it sets against each other peoples who are all virtually Slavs. The Serbs are Slavs, the Croats are Slavs, and the Bosnians are also Slavs. We say Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims. And the Bosniaks are also Slavs converted to Islam." End of quote. Confronted by a rather plausible hypothesis that the major ethnic groups living together in the Bosnia and Herzegovina are in fact subsequently ethnicized faith communities, definitely shaped under the Millet system of the Ottoman Empire, contemporary ideologists of ethno-nationalism try hard to ensure a structural priority and historical precedence of ethnicity over religious affiliation. Hence, if the constitutive peoples should not be considered as mere religious fractions of the people, it is of crucial importance to these ideologists to insist on the things ethnologists hold to be central for any ethnic identity, like common origin, kinship, etc. For instance, Horowitz writes, quote, "Ethnicity is highly inclusive group identity based on some notion of common origin, recruited primarily through kinship and typically manifesting some measures of cultural distinctiveness." End of quote. Whether some ethnic communities already fully constituted in the remote past preceded the faith communities as we know them today in Bosnia, or whether these latter were subsequently ethnicized, this is in Derridian sense undecidable. In the absence of reliable historical data, a vast field of speculation has been opened. All kinds of ethnic entrepreneurs, as Brubaker calls them, appeared engaged in that field recently. Given the almost full overlapping of ethnic and religious identity in the composition of ethno-religious groups, these entrepreneurs have a number of difficulties to resolve. How is it possible that the religious communal bodies perfectly fit in the ethnic communal bodies if there is no historical evidence that at a certain point in the past, entire Bosnian communities converted? If the difference between the ethnic and the religious component has to be preserved at any price under the threat of communal souls and bodies dissolution, then it seems that what poses the most serious challenge to such an endeavor is the insight into how the intergenerational transmission of the given ethnic identity actually operates. And indeed, it operates through the modes typical of faith communities. Not fake, faith. Without symbolic devices borrowed from powerful religious resources, there would be not possible to have the local ethnic boundaries persisting through centuries. These boundaries are traced and secured almost exclusively through ethnonyms, that is, pure symbolic markers clearly referring to this or that religious affiliation. Just as in the common labeling of Bosnian interreligious communities, ethnonyms are merged with religious denominations. So, Croats Catholics, Bosniak Muslims, Serb Orthodox Christians. So the great majority of personal names carry unambiguous reference to a determined religious affiliation. There are Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian personal names, and it is these names that make up three families of proper names. If ethnic communities are in principle imagined as large families, their seemingly real kinship is actually built upon these families of linguistic science. Therefore, in the particular multi-ethnic environment, the ethnic other is most often recognized and identified by his or her name. In the war, it was like, tell me your name, I will kill you. Oh, you are my brother in arms. No physiological science of recognition or whatever. So it's purely semiotic thing, yeah. Ending up in genocide or things like that. It is someone who has a strange, unfamiliar, that ethnic other. It is someone who has a strange, unfamiliar name, a name that cannot be found in the stock of proper names at the disposal of our community members. Exclusively belonging to the symbolic order, these families of signs provided to be able to impeccably and effectively govern in the long run. Recall Anthony Smith's famous longue durée, the real kinship relations and secure the boundaries of required ethnic endogamy. It's about kinship and endogamy. After having examined both sides of the collective identity classified as ethno-religious, what we have in the last analysis is a fraction or a fragment of the whole. Just as the particular religious communities remain parts of the wider Bosnian-Herzegovinian community, so these families of personal proper names remain incorporated in the language common to all inhabitants. of the country. The precarious boundaries against the larger society on the one side correspond to the precarious boundaries against the common language on the another side. It seems that any attempt to examine how mutually different, strange, or alien are the local ethno-religious communities will obtain a surprisingly poor result. In their main anchorages are the transcendental reality on the one side of reality of worship, and on the other side, symbolic reality of personal ethnonyms on the other side. Then they must be deeply affected in their everyday life by the lack of earthly reality. So on one side you have symbolic reality, on the other that transcendental reality of worship, but in the last analysis, what is in reality is lack of reality proper. Instead of ethno-religious communities, Bosnian, Croats, Serbs, and Bosniaks are more often viewed as simply ethnic groups. That's a common public discourse. We have ethnic groups. So-called international community representatives speaks all the time of ethnic groups, etc., in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This customary approach usually reveals that these groups lack what classical anthropologists consider the most important thing for an ethnic group: to have their own exclusive and rich ethnic culture. It is probably for that reason that the majority of scholars and analysts overestimate the role of local ethnic entrepreneurs and ideologists of so-called ethno-nationalism, who do the business Hobsbawm called inventing tradition. After the famous shift paradigm in anthropology made by Frederick Barth, we know that the cultural distinctiveness from the ethnic other is not a function of how rich and developed is ethnic culture of the given ethnie. The real cultural content does not matter as much as we used to think. Indeed, the smaller actual cultural differences, the greater the vigor with which the differences are being constructed. According to him, to Barth, the absence of real differences among ethnic groups does not destabilize the organization of, it's his expression, organization of social differences, or diminish the social power of group constructs. Instead, the reduction of differences in the reality often means fortification of the so-called border maintaining processes. End of quote. It seems that between the Bosnian ethnic groups there are no big real differences, and yet it is regretful that the Bosnian society is in the reality deeply divided along the ethnic lines. To resolve this paradox, should we believe that there are huge imaginary differences, like Benedict Anderson would say, that the people in this country are obsessed with myths and prejudice? There is a huge literature of production of myths in Serbia, in Croatia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc. What if the Bosnian ethnic cultures, in spite of all recent vigorous strives to enrich them, remained hardly distinctive from one another, and still mutually alien and even hostile? In fact, the present-day evident re-ethnicization of Bosnia ethno-religious communities does not imply a rapid development of their properly ethnic cultures. If this is true, then what kind of re-ethnicization is this? Should we then conclude, following Barth, that the smaller the mutual difference in real ethno-cultural elements, the bigger the difference in ethnic identities? Indeed, the difference we are tackling with is ethnic in the first place. But what does it mean to say, as it is often repeated, that the Bosnian society then is deeply divided along ethnic lines? How really ethnic are these so-called ethnic groups? Would it be a much more plausible hypothesis if we claim that the true identity of these groups is not as much ethnic as it is religious? What gives them their powerful, attractive force and inviolable cohesion quite recently acquired, if not the famous return of religion? It is not precisely this globally present rebirth of religious identities that makes the local ethnic groups actually de-ethnicized. Is religion a source of hatred and intolerance? Is it a major cause of the recent war in Bosnia? The difference in religion, aren't they what constitutes the insurmountable barriers between people of the country? In the book on the secularization of the world, Peter Berger, editor, writes, quote, "There is a good reason to doubt that three parties involved in Bosnian conflict, commonly represented as a clash between religions, are really inspired by religious ideas. I think it was P.J. O'Rourke who observed that these three parties of the same race speak the same language and are distinguished only by their religion, which none of them believe." End of quote. Nota bene, Patrick J. O'Rourke is, of course, American political satirist. But, as Adorno once said about Freud, in psychoanalysis, only the exaggerations are true. Again, we see that what makes the Bosnian nationalism so ridiculous, as Popper put it, the three belligerent parties were of the same race and speak the same language. Then, it seems that the only thing that divides one people into three is religion. I'm trying to find all the time that difference, and I'm not succeeding in doing that. Yeah. Is religion, and still, the conflict was only seemingly religious. This does not mean that we shall go thus far to claim that the local people are not religious at all. If we agree that what happened was by no means a clash of religions, we still have great difficulties to explain the war and especially the post-war xenophobic reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina. How was it possible that religion so perfectly served as a legitimation tool for political agendas based on a quite non-religious interests? What has actually made it so convenient for such illegitimate purposes? Another, much more difficult question reads, if the only difference between peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that of religion, why they consider themselves and their mutual differences in terms that reach far beyond religious identifications? Each people cherish its own, as John Stuart Mill called it, sentiment of nationality, and the common sympathies their members have are so markedly ethnic, primarily because, perhaps, they believe in their kinship to have originated from the same roots. Max Weber's notion of Abstammungsgemeinschaft is perhaps the clue of that sentiment, to explain it. So, how to explain the priority of the ethnic or quasi-ethnic self-consciousness over the religious one if the only surely identifiable difference between the three peoples is the difference in religion? If it's relatively plausible to think that in the time of sudden and bloody collapse of a totalitarian ideology and in the age of famous return of religion, the ordinary people may be made to think about the religion of their fathers as something which is deeply incorporated not only in their souls, but literally in their bodies, in their blood. It is much less plausible to think that after so many years their belief is a mere illusion imposed to everyone by mass media brainwashing. This is a common place of explanation of the right question of the present time, of the time still to be called, in Bosnia of course, the aftermath of the war, seems to be how the local religious identities have become ethnicized and even racialized. It is there that one should look for answers to questions like, these three Bosnian nations, are they mere appearances? Or how was it that religion, the Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, and Islam played a pivotal role in the massive war mobilization? Therefore, the hypothesis of re-ethnicization, as it seems, still holds. Anyway, it is present-day ethnopolitics developed by the political elites in power that would not allow, on behalf of their respective peoples, having only recently reached full-fledged national self-awareness, any regression to some primordial form of faith communities. Analogically, the recent re-ethnicization does not imply a reconstruction of some primordial form of ethnic affiliation. The re-ethnization proved to be a pretty unfruitful venture in spite of many passionate ethnic entrepreneurs, because it hasn't brought about three highly different ethnic cultures. There is no big differences, or at all, ethnic cultures. The re-ethnization seems to be pretty abstract and not regressive process. What ethnicized the local communities is actually what modernized them. Increasingly exposed to the processes of modernization and globalizations, these communities seem increasingly xenophobic, which may turn this reactive ethnicization into racialization. What makes then these three communities alien to each other? That was the beginning question, and this is the ending question, closing question. What is the true source of their mutual alienness, Fremdheit, in spite of the evident fact that they are so similar to each other? What kind of difference we are dealing with if it's so subtle and fragile and simultaneously unsurmountable? Let us recall that it is the slight difference between religiosity and ethnicity in the composition of each of three communities that entailed the same sort of difference between these communities themselves. The customary critique of ideology will certainly eliminate such a delicate difference of the ethnic identities as a pure simulacrum. The question remains, would ethnology be able to catch it in its genuine, unempirical reality? Thank you.
Dear colleagues, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank organizers for this opportunity to present my paper entitled Constitutional Identity as a Shield of New Nationalism. Some reflections on the use of the constitutional identity argument in the Hungarian Constitutional Court's case law. Why Hungarian Constitutional Court? I will talk about a tendency of the changed interpretation of the constitutional identity argument, and this tendency is the most obvious in Hungary. But I will also make some remarks regarding the case law of other constitutional courts, and also I will make some general remarks regarding some other questions such as the concept of neo-nationalism and some other general concepts. My presentation will be rather brief, but we can discuss later in longer form. In recent years, many European countries, and not just European countries, have seen a rise in populism, xenophobia, and nationalism. According to Banks and Gingrich, neo-nationalism could be defined or described as the re-emergence of nationalism under different global and transnational conditions. Neo-nationalism could be understood as a specific reaction against the effects of the current phase of globalization. Some of the presenters yesterday talked about these aspects and effects of globalization. So the main characteristics or features of neo-nationalism, according to these authors, would be the neo-nationalist stance towards immigration, also skeptical or negative stance toward Central European Union decisions, as well as populist appeals to the mass culture of the present. It also should be noted that this phenomenon is not a characteristic of Western Europe or Europe in general, as those authors stated. Neo-nationalism may have become particularly loud and conspicuous in Western Europe by the beginning of the 21st century, but parallel and comparable movements are simultaneously establishing themselves in Australia, New Zealand, and to an extent in Canada. For some reason they choose these countries, but as we heard yesterday, this tendency is present in other parts of the world too. Professor Matuštik told us about that defensive component or side or dimension of neo-nationalism, and indeed this is something that we can mention as the feature of neo-nationalism. According to Igor and Valdez, neo implies a modern form of nationalism occurring in a context of settled boundaries, whereby increased ethnic heterogeneity calls into question who has access to or sovereignty over an already established nation state. So neo-nationalism could be understood as a boundary maintenance project. It's not about state building, It's about defense of the boundaries. So, in my opinion, a metaphor of a wall or a shield is more appropriate to describe neo-nationalism than some other metaphors that are used, for example, sword. It's not so much about sword, it's more about shield, about defense, and for that reason I choose to entitle my presentation as Constitutional Identity as a shield of neo-nationalism. In my paper I will wrote and elaborate more about the concept of constitutional identity, and I will present different understandings of the concept of constitutional identity. Within this presentation, I will make just a few brief remarks, and I will talk about some understandings of this concept. According to Monica Polzin, a concept of constitutional identity is a relatively recent and an enigmatic notion. It is also, as many authors stated, a contested concept. There is no consensus about the meaning of this concept of constitutional identity. Although Monica Polzin wrote about a relatively recent concept, origins of this concept are rather old. The roots of constitutional identity go back to Aristotle. According to Aristotle, the identity of a state did not depend on its physical characteristics, but on its constitution. One of the possible understandings of the concept of constitutional identity is constitutional identity as a normative or a legal concept, and the roots of this concept could be found in the work of Carl Schmitt, also some other German constitutionalists, Bilfinger, for example, Monica Polzin wrote about. This genesis of the concept of constitutional identity. It needs to be stated that the concept of constitutional identity is intimately connected with the constitution of a given country. But there are different interpretations of this concept. This concept can be understood as the identity of the constitution itself, but also as the identity of the people related to the constitution. Also, according to one author, constitutional identity is a narrower concept than national identity, since it refers to the constitutional values and state structures. Whereas national identity comprises original, we could say, pre-constitutional values and or elements such as common language, customs, history, etc. So according to some authors, the concept of constitutional identity is connected with the concept of civic national identity or nation, and which should be differentiated to the ethnic concept of the nation. According to this author, Monica Polzin, there are 5 different discourses related to this concept. I will mention just 2 other understandings and classifications without wider elaboration. According to Marty, we need to differentiate between two conceptions of constitutional identity: the identity of the Constitution, a sort of essential element, basic structure, definitional elements of the Constitution, which cannot be amended. Changes of these parts of the Constitution, these essential elements, would be, according to this author, a constitutional revolution. So something different would be a product of these amendments. The other meaning of the concept of the constitutional identity would be the identity of the people. According to Rosenfeld, there are three distinct meanings of constitutional identity. First, identity that derives from the fact of having a constitution. Every country that have constitutions have a constitutional identity, and there exists by that fact constitutional identity. Secondly, the content of a constitution provides distinct elements of identity. And thirdly, the context in which a constitution operates seems bound to play a significant role in the shaping of its identity. So according to Rosenfeld, there are three distinct meanings of this concept. The concept of constitutional identity is very important regarding the relations between the European Union institutions and member states, governments and legislations. Respect for national identities, and we can claim that there is that we can put a question mark between the term constitutional identity and national identity is a commitment of the European Union institutions according to the European Union Treaty. I will briefly just point that out. According to the Maastricht Treaty, there was the obligation of the Union to respect the national identities of its member states, whose systems of government are founded on the principles of democracy. This rule was changed by the Amsterdam Treaty, and this second part of the sentence was excluded. So according to Amsterdam Treaty, the Union shall respect just the national identities of its member states. Democratic system wasn't mentioned anymore. More precise rule or provision is consisted in the Lisbon Treaty that entered into force in 2009. According to Lisbon Treaty, the Union shall respect the equality of member states before the treaties, as well as their national identities inherent in their fundamental structures, political and constitutional, inclusive of regional and local self-government. How much time is left?
You're fine. We have until 12.
We have tons of time
We have
because
15 minutes.
Okay, because I'm finishing the first part, so to I want to know how much time I have left. And after Lisbon Treaty, after this treaty entering in force, this argument of constitutional identity was used as an argument, as a sort of a hard shield, according to some authors, which should set limits to the European integration processes. I will mention just one decision of the German Federal Constitutional Court. In my paper, I will elaborate this more widely. In that first phase, an argument of constitutional identity was used in order to set limits on the integration processes, in order to clarify which parts of the constitution and which part of the jurisdictions and member states' responsibilities cannot be transferred to the European Union institutions. And obviously this is an argument of the constitutional identity as a legal concept. But I would like to talk about a tendency which is present in some of the member states, that this argument becomes sort of an instrument which should legitimate neo-nationalist politics, a sort of a shield that should protect member states and national borders from the measures that are defined at the European Union level. The migrant crisis has further strengthened the neo-nationalist sentiments and rhetoric across Europe. So some of the Central European countries started to use this argument in order to refuse the implementation of the European Union decisions that were related to the translocation of immigrants. In December 2016, the Constitutional Court of Hungary issued a decision in which we can recognize this new interpretation of the concept of the constitutional identity, this ethnocultural, we could say, understanding of the concept of the constitutional identity. I don't want now to talk more about circumstances in which this decision was passed. A colleague, Professor Boros from Hungary, can tell us more about the situation in Hungary. I would like to analyze briefly the meaning of the concept of the constitutional identity used in this decision, and according to the Constitutional Court of Hungary, the constitutional identity should be understood as Hungary's self-identity, as a fundamental value, not created by the Hungarian fundamental law, but merely acknowledged by the constitutional provisions. Something that we can recognize in the work of Carl Schmitt, that difference between constitution and constitutional laws. Constitutional laws that can be changed, but constitution as that part of the constitution which is not amendable, and I pointed out that understanding of this concept. Consequently, according to the Hungarian Constitutional Court, constitutional identity cannot be waived by way of any international treaty. Hungary can only be deprived of its constitutional identity through the final termination of its sovereignty, its independent statehood. This is not just a feature or characteristic of the reasoning of the judges of the Hungarian Constitutional Court. This is something that is present in some other countries, not just Central European countries, but this tendency is the strongest in this part of Europe, although we can suppose, we can understand that as a wider trend that could overcome other countries and their constitutional courts as well. What is interesting is that this interpretation of the concept of constitutional identity was confirmed by the Hungarian Parliament this year. In 2016, there was an unsuccessful attempt to amend the fundamental law of Hungary and to introduce this provision. But that attempt was successful this year. So Hungarian fundamental law was amended, and this provision became a part of the Hungarian constitution. According to this provision, the defense of the constitutional identity and the Christian culture is a duty of all state authority. So it is obvious that this ethnic or ethnocultural or cultural understanding of constitutional identity is dominant and now official understanding according to the Hungarian constitution or Hungarian fundamental law. Also, an act was passed which is also controversial because some anti-immigrant measures, and the Venice Commission issued a negative opinion regarding the provisions of this act. So I will make a brief conclusion. The notion of constitutional identity has been increasingly interpreted in ethnic terms. This ethnocultural understanding of the concept of constitutional identity becomes dominant, at least in some countries, which opens up possibilities for its use as a means of legitimizing policies with neo-nationalist features and for the promotion of exclusivist values. In other words, there is the tendency of using the concept of constitutional identity in order to legitimize neo-nationalist politics and to use this argument as a sort of a shield against those groups which are defined or treated as the other.